Buonasera a tutti, benvenuti su Liberi Oltre. Benvenuti a questa puntata dal titolo Una nuova guerra fredda. Avremo come ospite Edward Lucas, che ci raggiungerà tra alcuni minuti. Prima che Edward ci raggiunga, lo presento. Edward è un giornalista, scrittore ed analista che si occupa di Europa orientale e centrale sin dagli anni '80. È stato corrispondente per Independent, per BBC e per The Economist, da Cecoslovacchia, Polonia, dai Paesi Baltici, e come senior editor dell'Economist è stato Moscow Bureau Chief tra il 1998 e il 2002, che se ricorderete sono proprio gli anni dell'ascesa al potere di Putin. Edward è anche un senior fellow di SIPA, che è il Center for European Policy Analysis, è un editorialista per il Times. Di recente ha abbandonato il mondo dei think tank per diventare candidato dei liberal democratici alle elezioni inglesi nel collegio elettorale di Westminster. Elezioni inglesi che si terranno probabilmente entro il 2025, non sono ancora, programmate. Quello per cui abbiamo invitato Edward però è per partire come spunto da un suo libro, uscito nel 2007, quindi più di 15 anni fa, circa 15 anni fa, intitolato The New Cold War, Putin, Russia's and the Threat to the West. Ed è un libro che, se non avete avuto modo di leggere, temo non ci sia la traduzione in italiano, anche se potrei sbagliarmi, ma credo non ci sia. Se non avete avuto modo di leggere, è un libro che vale davvero la pena di recuperare, perché ovviamente contiene elementi profetici, in un certo senso, o come dire, qualcun altro potrebbe dire lungimiranti, nel senso che è riuscito a parlare e a mettere a fuoco un problema serio per quanto riguardava la sicurezza europea circa più di un decennio prima che il resto che molti altri se ne accorgessero. Vedo che Edward ci ha appena raggiunto, quindi gli do il benvenuto. Hello, Edward.
Hey, I'm so sorry for my disorganization, but you have my undivided attention now, so go right ahead.
No worries at all. We're so happy to have you here. I've just made a very short introduction in Italian, so we can move on to the questions. I was just telling the audience about a book you wrote back in 2007, The New Cold War, Putin's Russia and the Threat to the West. And in that book, back then, in 2007, you warned the West against the danger coming from Putin's Russia, the authoritarian element of his rule, the revanchist rhetoric, the imperialist territorial ambitions, and the weakening of European democracies through corruption and infiltration and so on. All of this you wrote back in 2007, before the invasion of Georgia, before Crimea, before the war in the Donbass. So all of this was very clear to you right at the time. And nevertheless, today, a lot of people seem surprised. And I've read somewhere that you said, well, if that's the case, it's because you were not paying attention. So can you help us understand what were the signs that you saw back then and that you paid attention to that made you, write the book back then? And how do we came from that to where we are now?
Well, I think the first thing I would say was I wasn't particularly clever or well-informed. I just had the great good fortune to be living in the Baltic states and keeping my eyes open. And what was very clear to me after 1991 was that the Communist Party of the Soviet Union had clearly disappeared and lost its monopoly of power, and the Soviet planned economy had collapsed. But Soviet imperial thinking, which is based on Russian imperial thinking, was still there, and that the Baltic states were having quite a tough time, chiefly trying to get the occupation forces who'd first arrived in 1940 to leave, that Russia was conducting information operations through propaganda attacks. And there were also these new things that the Soviet Union hadn't done, involving the sort of links between organized crime and business and politics and dirty money, the beginnings of what we would now later call cyber attacks. But there was a lot going on in the Baltic states. It was contested terrain, and they were warning very clearly that this was bad for them now and going to be bad for the West soon. And a particular friend of mine, the Estonian president Lennart Meri, actually gave a speech in Hamburg in 1994 warning about this. And rather amusingly, the Russian delegation at the dinner where he gave the speech got up and walked out of the room, and the leader of that delegation was none other than Vladimirovich Putin, at that stage heading the Foreign Relations Committee of the St. Petersburg municipal government. So this has very deep roots, and since then a great deal has happened to tell us that Russia is not the country that its cheerleaders say it is, that there's a serious problem with repression at home, and there's a serious problem with aggression abroad. And you could look at the Chechen wars, Putin's own statement, such as the collapse of the Third Reich is a geopolitical catastrophe. You could look at the use of energy as a weapon. You could look at the instance in Estonia in 2007 and Georgia in 2008, and the assassinations and all sorts of things. I could go on and on and on. But really, the fundamental problem was that we in the West were ignorant and arrogant and complacent, and most of all greedy. We just didn't want to accept what was going on because we were making tons of money by pandering to the Russian elite, who are looting their own country and enriching us in the process.
Were you at all surprised about the full-scale invasion 3 months ago?
Yes, I was absolutely wrong on this. I thought that it was a bluff. It was a maskirovka, to use the Russian word. I thought that Putin was threatening invasion in order to try and extract concessions, because that would be traditionally what Russia does. And I thought that a full-scale invasion would be almost insane because it wouldn't succeed. I was right on that. Would cause enormous international problems for Russia, and I was right on that. Would display the weaknesses of the Russian army. I was right on that. But he still did it. So I think I was right and Putin was wrong.
Well, it's a good place to be. What at this stage, what would you say is for you the most realistic outcome over the next months and, God forbid, years?
I think probably more of the same. Some victories for Ukraine, some victories for Russia. Possibly Russia's about to make a bit of a breakthrough in one part of the eastern front in the sort of peninsula of Ukrainian-controlled territory that extends into the Donbass. And there are reports of several hundred Ukrainian soldiers having to surrender after extraordinarily heavy bombardment from the Russians. On the other hand, Ukraine is also making some pushbacks, and the Ukrainian resistance seems to be gathering steam in places like Kherson. But I think that we're going to see a kind of Syrian scenario where Russia has the advantage of numbers and ruthlessness and brutality, and the Ukrainians have the advantage of morale and initiative and flexibility. And it will be a very more and more people are going to die, more and more people are going to be maimed and blinded and deafened and have appalling psychological injuries. There'll be more and more damage to the infrastructure, and it's just going to carry on like that for a bit. I think we have given Ukraine enough weapons that they won't lose, but we haven't given them enough weapons that they can win.
So, as you described it, we're facing now full-scale war in Europe. There's a country that is trying to redefine European borders by invading another one, based on some, ethno-nationalist, imperialist notion of blood and soil almost. And, we see tens of thousands of people killed, tens of millions of Ukrainians have lost their homes. It's a complete catastrophe with no, nothing like that in our living memory. Now, Putin and Russia, of course, are to blame for this. But one could argue that part or portion of that blame should go onto those, European leaders who for decades have chosen to appease Putin and patronize those like the Estonians, the Latvians, and the Lithuanians who were actually warning us against what was going on. How do you see Europe coming out of this? What do you think is the future of European security? What will be the role of NATO in that? And what will be Ukraine's future and position in that context?
Well, I think that there was a kind of honeymoon after the opening of the hostilities, or the intensification of hostilities in February the 24th, where a lot of people said to the East Europeans, gosh, you guys were actually right. And that lasted for about a month. And I'm afraid that now we are seeing a gradual polarization of opinion in Europe between what one might call the Peace Party and the Justice Party. And the Justice Party are the Balts, Finns, Poles, Czechs, some Slovaks, some other people, the Brits, who say Putin is the aggressor, and the only answer for that will guarantee the safety of Europe in the long run is Putin's got to lose. And we've just got to keep going until Putin loses, and do more, escalate if necessary, withstand Russian threats, put more weapons in, train the Ukrainians. I would argue put our own soldiers in there as well. And in the end, that's the only safe outcome, is the Russians have got to be really humiliated. This has got to be another 1917 for them. And the other party we might call the Peace Party, which says that even the worst peace is better than the best war. And this is causing terrible damage. We don't like the food and fuel and fertilizer price spikes. We don't like the refugees. We don't like the damage it's doing to our own economies. We want to get back to some sort of normalization with Russia. So let's put some pressure on the Ukrainians, and let's have a ceasefire now and then some talks, and maybe they'll get something back, and the Russians will do something, and we'll offer some reconstruction money, and that will be that. I think that would be disastrous, particularly if it's coupled with a refusal to put serious military forces in the Baltic, which is the big question that's facing us now. And regardless of what happens in Ukraine, we have a NATO summit coming up in Madrid. And that, I think, has got to make it absolutely clear that we are defending every inch of NATO territory. We are not going to have some tripwire followed by, cede a bit of ground and then come back again. We've seen what happens to people under Russian occupation, and we don't want that to happen to one single Estonian, Latvian, Lithuanian, or Pole, or Finn for that matter. And so that means a really serious effort to defend every inch of the Baltic states' territory and Finland. That means a standing defence plan. It means assigned forces. It means very serious thought to maritime strategy. It means new air and missile defence capabilities. It needs ISR, intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance. It means the whole thing, the whole caboodle. But we're not there yet, and I really worry about that.
And how do you see the request for entering into NATO on behalf of Finland and Sweden? How does that fit into that picture?
It's a very important precondition for solving a big security problem, and I've spent years working on the Baltic Sea as a region, and the fact that Finland and Sweden were not in NATO was a serious problem. Both have some military capabilities. The Finns have a lot. The Swedes rather less. Or they've got excellent submarines and a good air force, but they're skinny on the land side. And we were trying to do a kind of Rubik's cube of how to fit them into regional security in a way that would increase everyone's defence and deterrence. Now they're in, and they're going to be in. I don't think the Turkish objection is going to be crucial. And that creates the preconditions for solving all the problems I mentioned. Now, it doesn't actually solve the problems. And certainly what the Estonians, Latvians, and Lithuanians want is not some, a few Finnish artillery pieces. They want American Marines and lots of them in the Baltic. So there's still some big decisions to make. It doesn't directly affect the most vulnerable bit of the whole region, which is the so-called Suwałki corridor between Suwałki in Poland and Alytus in Lithuania, which is very vulnerable. You've got Kaliningrad on one side, Belarus on the other, and that's perhaps the most contested bit of real estate in Europe outside Ukraine right now. And Finland and Sweden are not going to directly make that more secure. On the other hand, it does mean we can put pressure on Kaliningrad, which is Russia's sort of last big geopolitical trophy from the Second World War, And Kaliningrad, once we get our air and sea arrangements properly teed up, Kaliningrad's has got a serious problem. So we can say to the Russians, yes, you can cause difficulties for us on the Suwałki corridor, but we can cause difficulties for you in Kaliningrad. That's all to be worked out.
As you mentioned, you lived and worked in the Baltics for several years, and you have a very good knowledge and understanding of the Baltics. And since our audience is mostly in Italy, I'm telling you, most people in Italy, I don't think, have a very good knowledge or understanding of the situation the Baltics have been in over the past decades. So today on the Times, actually, you wrote a piece saying that the next secretary of NATO should be from Estonia. Can you help us understand a bit what the situation has been for the Baltics over the past 15, 20 years, from the time they joined NATO, in what conditions they've been, and how the encroaching of Russian has shaped their understanding and their politics and their foreign policy?
I think the best way to think about the Baltics is as victims of imperialism, and this works particularly well when you're explaining to people who've suffered imperialist domination by another country in living memory. I think that the ability of the Baltic states to preserve their languages and cultures under 50 years of pretty heavy Sovietization is remarkable. I think that the way they've made a great success of their independence, or the regaining of independence since 1991, is also remarkable. Many people thought they were going to be like another Moldova, sort of divided, poor, unstable, heavily influenced by Russia, and they've all become successful modern democracies with advanced, more than middle income economies. And that's sometimes not fully appreciated, I think, in the West, and certainly on things like e-government, for example. Estonia is ahead of pretty much every other country in Europe. And I know Italians are very interested in e-government, and it's something that Prime Minister Draghi has been pushing. But what is dreamed of in Italy happens in Estonia. And so the idea that these are sort of backward Eastern countries is wide off the mark. I think they've also got a very highly developed security culture. They understand this cocktail of hybrid threats, money, propaganda, lawsuits, organized crime, cyber dirty tricks, all the rest of it. And they have a lot to offer to the rest of us in how to deal with it, and we should take that advice on board. And fundamentally, Italy is part of NATO, and NATO is got its credibility on the line in the Baltic states. And if NATO fails the Baltics, then NATO's failed everywhere.
Yeah, I think it was very important to point out the element about e-government. I think the Party of Peace in Italy definitely very often uses this expression called New Europe, which I find quite annoying to refer to the Baltics as this new part of Europe that is kind of pushing old Europe to confrontation against Russia, which of course is complete nonsense. But as you were pointing out, they very often ignore or misunderstand or just misrepresent the fact that these three countries are a history of success. They're three former Soviet countries that are now completely integrated in Europe and are full democracies and score much better than some countries of old Europe on things like corruption and level of democracy and human rights. So it's something that we should draw more attention to, and it's definitely widely ignored in Italy. Coming to the UK now, the UK is being perceived as one of the countries that, at least in the rhetoric, are leading on supporting Ukraine. Definitely, Boris is one of the most loved foreign leaders in Ukraine. I definitely have a personal experience of that. However, for years, he's being harshly criticized, and not only himself, but the governments before him, by yourself and by others, for not doing nearly enough to tackle corruption, money laundering, infiltration of Russian dirty money in the UK. How do we square this kind of strong rhetoric and undeniable, military support for Ukraine with this lack of action on the sanctions and on tackling corruption until very recently?
It's a paradox. I think one thing is that post-Brexit, Britain is having to do more on defence and security to make up for the loss of its political and economic influence, which it exercised through the European Union. And the fact that countries like Sweden and Finland and the Baltic states and Poland are very grateful for British support creates a sort of a kind of pro-London camp within the EU, which to some extent counterbalances the more difficulties that we face from countries like France. Difficulties, I should say, which are entirely of our own making. I was strongly against Brexit. I think that the Britain's defence and intelligence and security capabilities are real. They can be overstated, and our stocks are pretty skinny on some things. And I know there's some worry in the military about quite how much stuff we're shipping to Ukraine, because it leaves us short. And although we spend 2% of GDP on defence, which is great, that's money spent pretty thinly, including some rather expensive aircraft carriers, the point of which has never been completely, I think, proved, at least to me, and the very expensive business of a strategic, continuous at-sea nuclear deterrent, so I think even before this there was a black hole in the defence budget, and now with the extra commitments to Ukraine there's an even bigger black hole, and something's going to have to give, and that doesn't always come across from Boris Johnson's rather boosterish rhetoric. I think the bigger point is that this, to some extent, covers up the huge failure of this government to deal with dirty money in London, which is still there. We have a lot of press releases and gimmicks about a new anti-kleptocracy cell and this and that, and it all sounds fine. But actually, dirty money continues to slosh through the city quite well. We haven't really done anything about the use of legal intimidation of lawsuits to silence critics, something which I've got personal experience of. And the legal and financial loopholes for people who want to cover up the origins of their money and use it to exert influence are still absolutely gaping. So I think there's a huge amount still to do. But I, as a friend of Ukraine and as a supporter of the Baltic states, I welcome the fact that Britain's playing a robust role. It's a nice problem to have, to say you're doing the right thing, but please do more of it, as opposed to saying you're doing the wrong thing, which is what you have in some other countries.
Definitely. And actually, could you expand a bit on the issue of intimidation via lawsuit? It's something that I'm pretty sure our audience doesn't know too much about it, but it was quite prominent in the UK of the past few years.
Yes, I mean, we have a libel law which has two problems. One is that it puts the onus of proof on the person who stated something to prove that it's true. So if I say that someone is a Kremlin puppet, they can sue me, and I have to then prove that they're a Kremlin puppet. Otherwise, I have to pay them and apologise. So we don't have the sort of protections that the American First Amendment gives. There was an attempt to reform the libel law a few years ago, which created some defences on responsible journalism and the expression of an honest opinion, but those have been chipped away by the courts. And we also have another sort of related series of legal problems, that you can be hit with privacy law and with data protection law, and I would argue that collecting data on people without their consent is basically journalism. So it's difficult to defend these things. So that's one lump of problem. The law is not very friendly. And the second is it's fantastically expensive. So if you are defending a libel action, you're looking at hundreds of thousands of pounds. I was involved in one where the bill was £500,000. I didn't have to pay it myself, but that's what it cost us just not to lose. And we are being sued by a Russian oligarch who counts his fortunes in the many tens of millions, probably in the hundreds of millions. So for him, this is nothing. And this creates a situation where very rich, dodgy people from all over the world can go to a London law firm and say, spray my critics with threatening letters. They won't be able to afford it, and I can. And that's a very effective tactic. It's sometimes called SLAPS, strategic lawsuits against public participation. And we are pushing back on this. My friend Bill Browder is trying to get the lawyers involved in this ban from traveling to the United States, which is annoying them a lot. So there are things you can do, but it's a weakness in our system, and it's one that these people exploit.
Yeah, and that actually draws attention to the fact that we've been sanctioning the puppets, as you would say, but we haven't we don't have a clear way to sanction the enablers that we have in the West. What do you think would be a way of doing that?
Well, I think there's a great deal you can do, but there's no single bullet. One thing is to have proper professional regulation, and at the moment we don't really regulate our accountants or our lawyers in any meaningful way. So, even if they are breaking the rules in the terms of the sort of clients they take on, and not checking their source of funds and so on, nothing much happens. Another thing we can do is actually change the law so that these legal means to intimidate reputable journalists are reined back in again. We could also make libel less expensive and have sort of quick, cheap arbitration before it goes to court, which in most cases would solve the problem. We can also apply normative pressure and just say to people, you should be ashamed of doing this. You're working for fascist gangsters who've launched a war that's killed tens of thousands of people and shattered millions of lives. And why does your business model and your conscience allow you to do that? So we can do that. And then there's these sort of no-fly zones, which I'm working on, where they will just find it very, very difficult to conduct either their personal or professional lives, because they, in the ideal world, the British ones wouldn't be able to travel to either Europe or to the United States, and the American ones wouldn't be able to cross the Atlantic, and the European ones wouldn't be able to go to Britain or the United States. So we can. There are things we can do, but it'll be a major campaign.
So that's because it would be, of course, tricky to sanction your own citizens. So you would kind of like have a cross sanction where everyone is sanctioning everyone else, so they can't travel around, which is quite ingenious. I know you had you gave us half an hour, so I'm coming to a close. But I wanted to ask you one more question. And earlier on, you spoke about the so-called party of peace. So those in Europe who are not, Putin sympathizers or Putin appeasers necessarily, but who would simply argue, the most important thing is to end this war. It doesn't matter how onerous and how unjust that peace is. It's just a we're just dealing with a tragic situation, and we just need to stop this war. And it doesn't matter if that is at the expense of Ukraine's territorial integrity or at the expense of Ukraine's sovereignty. What would you say to that argument? What would be your best argument against that?
Well, it's a great final question. And I think the fundamental point I would say is you're just postponing the problem. If Russia's war on Ukraine has succeeded from a Russian point of view, they will take away some very important lessons from that aggression works. You get more territory, you crush your biggest and most troublesome neighbor is in ruins. And you've also taught the West a lesson. You can't defend your friends. And our willpower, Russia may be smaller than the West in economic and political terms, but in terms of willpower, its willpower has beaten our willpower. And that lays the foundation for a far more terrifying conflict with NATO in the coming years. And we will the safety and security of all of Europe is at risk right now. Ukrainians are fighting and dying for our freedom and for our security as well as their own. If they win we're much safer and freer. And if they lose, we're in terrible danger.
I think that's the best note to end it on. Thank you so much for coming, Edward, and for your time.
Grazie, and arrivederci, and thank you so much for all the help you've given me to my campaign here. And it's been one of the great benefits of being involved in politics, is I've got to know you guys. So it's terrific, and I look forward to our next meeting being face to face rather than atom to atom, rather than electron to electron.
Thank you so much. I wish, next time let's meet in person.
Good. Okay. Bye-bye.
Good evening. Grazie. Bye-bye.